This happened about 20 years ago when I was in high school. Our family had just moved into a brand new building. Every day was full of excitement in our new place. We used to live in a very small apartment, but our new one was very spacious. It was absolutely amazing to me. The new place was on the ground floor, and it even came with a garden as well. I just loved it. Opposite our garden was another big apartment. We could look outside and see people coming and going up and down the corridors to their homes. After a few weeks, though, my mother idly remarked, "Oh, the underwear I hung out to dry in the garden is gone. Do we have an underwear thief or something?" Because we live on the ground floor and the wall is quite big, I thought there was no way someone could have jumped over it and into our garden. It was way too high. Maybe they used a stick or a long pole with a hook or something to steal it off the line. I just know I didn't really want to think about it too much. One day, when I went out into the garden though, I could see a man on the 3rd or 4th floor in the building opposite to us. He was stood completely still, just blankly staring over at me. He looked to be in his 20s. He was wearing a sweatshirt, a tracksuit, and was very casual looking. He began walking down the corridor towards the stairs. He was going very slowly and kept eerily staring at me the whole time he was going. I was freaked out by his dead stare. A chill went up my spine, and eventually I couldn't bear to be in his sights anymore. I went back into my house and hid in my bedroom. Something about his staring felt so perverse. After this incident, we stopped drying our laundry in the garden. Sometime later, though, I noticed something. Something had been dropped in our garden. I took a bit of a closer look, and I noticed it was a set of tweezers. They weren't the everyday kind, though. They looked like they were the ones from a hospital or something. Kind of like forceps. You know, the kind they use in operations. They had grips on their handles, and they were really long. Of course, they didn't belong to anyone in my family. No one knew who they belonged to, or where they'd come from. At this point, we'd noticed 3 weird things happening. The underwire going missing, the stranger staring at me, and now this big pair of tweezer-like things. It felt like someone was spying on our family, but for what purpose? Several days after I found the tweezers, the doorbell rang. My mother went to answer. I was at school at the time. A man was stood at the front door. My mother asked him what he wanted, and he replied in a kind of shy demeanor. "I dropped my tweezers in your garden a few days ago, and I wanted to go get them. Any way you think about it, unless he threw them in, there's no way he could have just dropped them." Knowing this, my mother asked him how he had dropped them in our garden. He made up some excuse like, "I live in the apartment over there. I was jumping up and down and they kind of fell out of my pocket into your yard." When I heard about this exchange later, I got real goosebumps. He jumped and they magically fell 10 meters across the way into our yard. All of his behavior was just completely odd. Jumping up and down in the corridor of an apartment block for no reason was weird anyway. Walking around with a huge pair of forceps was weird. Waiting a few days and coming back to get them from our garden, that was just scary. I got frightened. I imagined coming home from school and just seeing him in the garden with those tweezers in hand, terrifying my mother. She told him we didn't find anything in our garden. They weren't there, and she told him to leave right now. She told me she was going to be extra vigilant. She wouldn't open the door fully from then on, and kept the chain on as well. She hadn't wanted to look him in the eye when she'd seen him. She said his voice sounded young. She wouldn't be surprised if it was the strange guy who'd stared at me in the garden a few weeks past. After he came to our door, no more suspicious incidents occurred. I heard from a classmate who lived in the same building that the man who lived there had been arrested for stealing underwear. I have no idea if it was Mr. Tweezers or not. Even though he didn't cause me any direct harm, I guess because he didn't really get the chance, the idea that he had been watching me the whole time and was stealing my underwear was chilling. I stopped going out into the garden. If I had to go out there, I would make sure the time I spent there was as short as possible. This incident really shocked me, needless to say. It ruined all the joy of moving into a new place. Since then, whenever I've moved house, I've never chosen to live on the ground floor area. This happened when I was at university. My friend had just moved into a new apartment, so me and a bunch of friends decided to drop in on him. His place wasn't new, but it wasn't exactly old either. It was the very definition of pretty decent. His apartment was 3 stories high. There was a narrow staircase leading to the entrance, and a little path leading to the room on the ground floor. Opposite from this was a bicycle parking area. My friend's room was on the corner of the 2nd floor of that complex. On that day, I remember there being a lot of rain. We went to the local supermarket to get some beers and some snacks. We were heading back to his room to surprise him when we went into his apartment. I put my bag down, followed by my umbrella, when suddenly one of my friends shouted, "What's the matter with you?" I jumped out of my skin practically. We all looked at my friend who'd suddenly shouted, then followed his eye line. He was looking over the stairs towards the bicycle parking area. There was a woman stood beneath a flickering light in the corridor. She stood out completely because for some reason she was dressed entirely in black. She looked to be about 30 or 40 and had long dark hair too. Her hair was jet black just like her clothes were. Because of how camouflaged she was, it almost looked like her white face was just floating in the darkness. This mystery woman was just stood there staring at all of us. No, she wasn't staring in our direction really. It was as if she had this 1,000-yard stare, staring at something beyond us. We were surprised, needless to say. We gave her a little bow as an apology. We felt bad for staring at her and yelling at her just because she'd surprised us. As soon as we walked into his apartment, we started to talk about that woman. She was pretty creepy. Man, that was kind of weird, huh? Yeah, that was scary. I mean, what the hell is she doing down there? Does she even live here? If she did live here, I wondered why she didn't just go over to her own apartment instead of just standing there in the corridor. Hey, come on guys, don't freak me out. I just moved in here. We drank beers and played some games and completely forgot about that woman. Later, when we were out of beers, 2 of my friends wanted to go on a beer run. Me and the owner of the apartment decided to stay behind and wait for them. Within 5 minutes, though, they suddenly burst back in. Hey, guys, why don't we all go? That woman is still standing there staring at your apartment. It's way too creepy to go alone. My friend who just moved in was too freaked out to go, though, and since the rest of us were pretty buzzed, we went to go get the drinks together. We joked that it was kind of like a dare or something. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I took a glance toward the place we'd seen her last, and sure enough, there she was, standing in the exact same spot, staring off into nothingness. What the hell? While we were on our way to the convenience store, we talked about her more. I said that when we got back, I'd go say hello to her and see if she was all right. I'd let them know what happened. I was curious about her, and I was also a little bit concerned. However, when we got back, she wasn't there anymore. Deep down, I was actually a little relieved. We did find her sudden disappearance mysterious, though. I mean, she'd been out there for quite a long time. I stayed over and left my friend's house the next morning. Surprisingly, nothing else strange happened at all that night. A few weeks went by and I bumped into my friend who'd moved in. He told me he was thinking of moving out already. What? You're already moving? Dude, you just moved in like a week ago. He looked at the floor and just said, "That woman, I can't deal with it, man." According to my friend, That woman appeared every single rainy day and just stood in the exact same spot under the light in the bicycle parking area. Every time it rained, he couldn't help getting frightened watching her stare at his apartment for hours on end. I couldn't understand that woman's behavior, sure, but I thought my friend moving out because of it was kind of unnecessary. It's not like she even tried to do anything to him. My friend then told me, though, that he'd tried to start a conversation with the woman to see what was up with her. That's pretty brave, I thought. Apparently, the conversation went something like this. Hi there. I moved in on the second floor recently. I'm sorry about the other night. My friends and I were a bit loud. She didn't say anything. She didn't even look up at him. She just continued to kind of stare through him into the distance and didn't say a single word. He even contacted the owner of the building, but nothing ever came of it. Whenever it rains, even if it's the morning or the middle of the night, somehow she'll always be standing right there. He told me she always just stood there, staring off into space. She didn't do anything to anyone, but it was too creepy for him to bear. He wanted to move away from there as fast as he could. At first, I thought maybe she was a ghost or something, but obviously she's not. She only stands there whenever it rains, and I remembered obviously seeing the rain impacting on her, so it's definitely not something paranormal. I wonder why. I wonder what she saw or what happened to her that made her like this. After a few months, my friend was able to move out. He never found out who that woman was, and no one he asked about her seemed to know either. Possibly she even still stands in that corner beneath that gloomy light on every rainy day. I remember it was a Friday. I woke up early in the morning to get up for work. I dragged myself out of bed and into the kitchen to make my coffee. I took very light steps into my daughter's bedroom and gave her a kiss on the head, trying not to wake her up. I then tiptoed back to the kitchen and grabbed my coffee. "Good morning," I heard my daughter call out from behind me. I turned around and replied, "Good morning, sunshine." I told her to go grab her stuff and get ready for school. She walked back to her room and I heard silence for a while. I walked in and saw her asleep in her bed. I woke her up and tried to keep her awake. I asked her why she was so tired. Her reply was the most bone-chilling thing I'd ever heard. Let me remind you that she was only 8 years old. "Well, there's this really scary guy who visits me at night." That was already weird enough, so I asked her to elaborate further. "You mean in your dreams?" She told me, "No, Daddy, when I'm awake he comes out and tells me scary stories. They really keep me up." She started trying to look around me, like she was trying to look into her closet or something. I got up to go check out the closet, and of course there was nothing there but clothes. I made sure to tell her that if this person ever came back again to let me know. "But Dad, I shouldn't have told you at all. He said if I told anyone he'd hurt me." I replied, "No one will hurt you as long as I'm here, okay?" After that, I took her to school. I went to work, and at work, my boss and I were having a conversation. I ended up telling him about the closet creature. He laughed and told me it was just her imagination probably. His kids had had their own phase about this sort of thing. I laughed too, but honestly, I was a bit weirded out about it. After work, I picked up my daughter, and we went home. I made us some dinner and asked her with curiosity to draw this thing in her closet. She did so. It only had a little bit of hair, a white face, and a pointy nose that was black around his eyes, and what appeared to be blood on his clothes or something. Even as a grown man, this scared me a bit. What the hell was happening to make my daughter dream about such disturbing things? I tried not to show how unsettled I was, though. I wanted to know for sure if this was actually a dream, or if she was seeing something in real life that was making her think about this. That night, I peeked into her room every 30 minutes or so. It must have been 1 in the morning, and I was still up. I had work the next day, but I couldn't go to bed without knowing, because either way, my daughter had a problem, and I needed to help her with it. To do that, though, I needed to know what was happening in the first place. I waited until she went to bed and peeked into her room every 30 minutes, like I said, to see what was going on. She was pretty quiet. She lay on her bed and most of the time was perfectly asleep. After 30 minutes passed by, I walked into her room again. I peeked around the corner. She was laying in her bed asleep. Before I went back to waiting for a little while longer, though, I looked up to the window next to her bed and I couldn't breathe. Similar to her drawing, but of course a bit different, there was what appeared to be a man in a clown getup tapping at her window. It looked like he was mouthing something to her, something like, "Hey, wake up!" At this point, I was outraged. I wasn't even thinking, really. I ran over to the window. The clown saw me before I actually reached him and took off running. I realized I should have gone out the front door and snuck up on this freak, but it was already too late. "Daddy, what's happening?" My daughter was awake now and very confused. I told her to stay put as I jumped out her window. Outside, I saw the guy running down the road as fast as he could. He was really taking off. Immediately, I called the police and filed a report. I wasn't going to be able to catch up with him with that much of a head start. It's been several weeks now, but they never found anyone matching the description. It scares the hell out of me knowing this freak is still out there, and he knows where we live as well. Later that night, or should I say that morning, I sat my daughter down and gave it to her straight. I drilled into her head that she's not supposed to talk to strangers, to anyone she doesn't know, and to keep her window shut and locked no matter what. I wasn't that confident in those measures though, so I ended up boarding up that window anyway. No one would be getting in or out. For the longest time, my daughter always slept in my bed. Jesus, that was the most awful experience. It scares me knowing what kind of perverts and freaks are out there. I try not to think about what could have happened had he ever gotten inside. What about the part of him being in the closet, though? I asked my daughter about it, and she said he used to sneak in and sleep in there. At the time this happened, I was 14, and weirdly enough, I was going to the circus that was in town. If I remember correctly, the place was called the Clown's Nest or something. It had quite a weird name, I know, but I was going and I was pretty excited. I bought my ticket and some popcorn and went in and took a seat. The backstage door opened slightly. And inside I could see what looked like a man in his early 40s with green dyed hair. I sat back and relaxed, waiting for the show to start. There were 3 other clowns, 2 men and a woman. The woman was real skinny, and one of the men was really tall and muscular. The second guy and third clown was the one I had seen backstage just a few moments ago. He had green hair and red lipstick with white makeup, but had black eyes which must have been contact lenses. The clowns ran around throwing flowers to the audience down below. A man with black spandex covering his body ran and climbed a pole and jumped on a trampoline doing some tricks. I noticed that the older man clown was staring at one particular area in the audience. The show went on for a while longer when I heard a raspy voice to my left. A few minutes ago, a man and his daughter had sat down right next to me, and recently that man had gotten up to go to the bathroom, or go to the concession stand, I guess. I'm not sure which. I decided to listen in since something weird was going on here just from the vibe I was getting. The voice asked this little girl, "Hey kiddo, you want to go backstage?" The whole situation sounded freaky. When I heard this though, I turned to my left immediately. There was that clown very creepily standing next to the girl. Better yet, the girl actually said yes. The clown then said this to her, "I shit you not. No worries, you get some special perks 'cause I'm your dad's friend." They stood up and started to walk off. Being both weirded out and very worried, I decided to follow behind them. I couldn't help but think this guy must be a freak. Before they actually made it backstage, I couldn't bear this any longer. I ran over and grabbed the girl's hand. They both looked surprised and stared over at me. I told her I'd buy her and her dad some popcorn if she came back to her seat quietly, and I'd give her some candy as well. She said okay, while the clown made a very angry face and stomped away. I don't really know what he had been planning, but I couldn't help but feel furious at this guy anyway. Like I had promised, I took the girl back to her seat, bought her and her dad popcorn, and gave her some candy I had. I explained to her dad what happened, and he thanked me. We actually ended up walking home together. As we talked, he wanted to thank me once more for what I did, and said he'd be sure not to leave his daughter alone again like that. They both walked inside their house, and I began my own walk home. It turned out my place was only a couple of blocks down anyway. I couldn't help but notice, though, that behind me was a man in a hood that had been following us for quite a while. I didn't want to be a jerk and immediately assumed the guy was a creeper, but after making so many turns and following us for so long, he was still following me. As I continued walking, when I finally turned onto my own sidewalk, I turned around abruptly and asked the man if I could help him with something. I then heard that same raspy voice from before. No, I was just looking around. I told him okay, but he should probably be getting home now. It was about midnight around this time. He then replied that he thought my house was for sale and he wanted to go visit it. I told him it was not for sale, and I told him so long. I told him I had some buddies waiting on me. When I turned around, though, I heard him say there were no friends waiting on me. This kind of freaked me out, because I had been lying to make sure he knew there were other people not so far away. I didn't reply this time. I just kept walking and went inside. I immediately looked out the window to see this guy just standing there for the longest time. I was nervous to call the cops because I'd never done that before, but I was getting pretty scared. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, staring at this guy. He was just on the sidewalk looking toward the house. He didn't move a single inch. Eventually, the freak blew a kiss at me and walked away. The next day, I told my parents what happened. I think they believed me, but they found the story quite funny, which kind of irritated me. To this day, I don't trust any clowns. If I had a moral to the story, it'd be to always look after your kids. It only takes a few seconds for a strange old man to take them, and you never know who that old man could be. I remember waking up from the nap to the sound of my girlfriend sobbing somewhere else in the home. I got up to see what was wrong and determined the sound must be coming from downstairs. I followed the sound down the spiral staircase all the way to the finished basement. The sound was definitely coming from the little half bathroom at the bottom of the stairs that we rarely ever used. The door was also closed, which it never was. I couldn't see any light coming from underneath, but the sound was very loud. It was obviously coming from the bottom of these stairs. It was about this time I started to fully wake up, and suddenly I remembered my girlfriend had already left for the grocery store when I'd started my nap. I could see her parking spot from one of the windows, and her car was not there. Obviously, she wasn't home. I called out her name, and the sobbing instantly stopped. I couldn't hear anything further. When I finally got the courage to go down those steps and open the door, the bathroom was completely empty. I never found out who the sobber was, but it was definitely a creepy experience. There used to be an abandoned rubber factory on the edge of my town. Before it was torn down a couple of years back, I decided to go exploring there once. I tried all the doors, but they were all barred. I did, however, find a crack in a concrete wall around the back that was just big enough for me to slip through and get inside. It was really neat in there. There were abandoned things that must have been in storage for decades, a bunch of old conveyor belts and factory equipment, all kinds of drug paraphernalia as well. I even found a random painting of Jesus in a makeshift shrine. That's not the creepy part though. I was walking around exploring this abandoned factory. It was about 8 p.m. or so, just after it got completely dark. I looked around for an hour or so, and aside from all that old shit, there was really nothing out of the ordinary. And that was when I started to hear some music playing, something bluesy, somewhere deeper in the factory. I'm not easily scared, and I kind of wanted to figure out what sort of freak was listening to old records in an abandoned factory, because honestly, that sounded like something I would do. I tracked down the noise after about 5 to 10 minutes. I could tell it was coming from a room further down, somewhere in what must have been the basement. There was a doorway covered with a tarp. I went inside. The room was a huge contrast with the rest of the dingy old factory. The walls were bright purple, and the room was warm like there was a space heater in it or something, whereas the rest of the area was completely freezing. As I walked in further, I saw there was a cassette player just laying there on the floor, playing a song which I later tracked down to be Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles. I never found out what the other songs that had been playing were, but I guess that doesn't really matter. I noticed a bunch of papers taped to the walls. They all said, "She gotta run, she gotta run." If I were to guess, there were at least 100 sheets that said the exact same phrase, just plastered over all the walls. Laying on the floor, there was a chair that looked like it had been detached from a school desk. In the corner, there was a statue of some animal that was really badly chipped and burned, like someone had tried to destroy it. I also noted there was a stack of VHS tapes that had the names of women on the sides. I only remember seeing Jessica on multiple tapes, but there were a few other names. I left shortly after, because I got worried whoever owned all of this would come back and find me snooping around. Heck, I figured they might have already been in the building with me. I couldn't stop thinking about this for a few weeks. I was convinced it was either a serial killer or some guy with a porn collection he couldn't risk having at home. Maybe something even worse was on those tapes. I went back with a friend, but when we got there, they had already started demolishing the place, and it was inaccessible. I'll always wonder what was on those tapes, but a part of me is very glad I'll never know. This happened to me personally about 15 years ago, when I was a Girl Scout. We were staying at a campground this year, and one of the rules imposed upon us was that it was mandatory we have a buddy as part of a buddy system. That meant you were always supposed to have someone with you if you left the group, anytime, day or night. We spent the day doing activities at the campground, and when we all went to bed, I remember the cabin smelling very musty. None of the girls liked it much. I think it's one of the reasons I had a lot of trouble sleeping. The smell would just overcome me in waves and make me feel real uneasy. When I finally did manage to fall asleep though, I remember being awoken by my buddy in the bunk underneath me. She tapped me several times on the shoulder, but it wasn't until she poked my face that I really woke up. I was a little bit annoyed, but she said she really needed to go to the bathroom. And, as it was an annex to our cabin, I had to walk with her to make sure she got back safely. Still groggy, I agreed. I was just descending the ladder when I saw her start walking towards the door. I quickly threw on my slippers to catch up with her, as I didn't want her to get in trouble for me not being with her if an adult happened to be awake and walking by. I caught up to her just as she was opening the door, and I stood at the door of the restroom waiting patiently. I hoped all she needed to do was pee, as I was still quite tired. I waited for about a minute and asked if everything was okay. She shouted back that she wouldn't be long. I continued waiting. At least 15 minutes went by though, and my buddy still had not emerged from the stall. I was getting rather impatient now. I'd banged on the door, but this time there was no reply. I waited in silence for her to say something, but there was no response. At this point, I started to get worried, thinking that something must have happened to her. Maybe she fainted, or maybe she fell back asleep again. Thinking it was probably the latter, I bent down under the door of the stall to see if she was okay. Oddly enough though, I couldn't see anything inside. Not a pair of legs, not anything. I was not quite sure exactly what was going on, and it was very cold outside. The cold air for the last 15 minutes had really woken me up. I thought she must have been playing a prank on me of some kind. I went into the next cubicle and stood on the toilet to look in. However, when I looked down, there was no one in there. A feeling of pure dread engulfed me as the cubicle next to those two unlocked by itself, and the doors slowly began to swing open. I jumped down off the toilet and tried to hide. I could hear a voice from the next door over, whispering something to me. I was too scared to listen though. I ran all the way back to the cabin without looking back. When I got back to my bunk, I saw my buddy was already back there, fast asleep on the bed underneath mine. I just about shit myself, and I couldn't sleep a wink that night. I never told anyone my experience, and continued as a Girl Scout until I became a troop leader myself. It was at this point in my life when I was a lot older, and happened to be chatting to some older scout leaders about camps and cabins in our local area for some of our troops, when all of a sudden we started talking about the same campground I had my experience at. She told us she really didn't like going there, because years ago when she was a young girl, some person she didn't know tried to lure her out of the bathroom. This incident happened in a flat when I was 6 or 7 years old. I remember this very clearly still to this day, and it makes my spine shiver thinking about it. I had the largest bedroom in the flat. My mom had decorated the walls with pink and lavender paint and cute little metallic swirls. I had bunk beds, glittery curtains in my windows, charms and glittery things hanging from the ceiling. Any girl like me's dream. I remember getting into bed that night, and everything seemed normal at first. My room usually wasn't too dark because the moonlight shining through my window through my glittery curtains. I was trying to sleep for what seemed like a while when, I don't know why, but I started to look around my room, particularly in the alcove area in the dark corner. I couldn't focus my eyes properly for a minute, but when I did, I noticed a head of one of those plastic lady things you do makeup on. Her hair really stood out in the moonlight against the dark, creepy corner. I remember going to lay back down in my bed when suddenly I had the urge to look back up. As I did, I was paralyzed with fear. At first, I thought I might be imagining it because I had been staring at that plastic lady head, but I swear I could see a dark woman's outline standing right next to it. It was like a dark gray-black mist, but in the shape of a woman. I slowly looked at it with massive bulging eyes, scanning over it. I saw she had no feet. There was nothing there. No shadow, no feet, nothing. It was like she was levitating 10 inches off the ground, and it seemed she was moving slowly towards me. I was absolutely terrified. I'll always remember this because of how cripplingly scary it was, and how I couldn't bring myself to move at all. All I could do was try my best to duck myself tighter under the quilt wrapped around me. There are no labels or anything that could have emulated what happened next. I was shaking, trying not to breathe loudly, not able to move at all, when I felt something behind me, leaning over me. I closed my eyes, when all of a sudden I felt a tickle on the back of my neck. You know, the feeling you get when someone unexpectedly puts their cold fingers on your skin. It started off like that, and quickly became more aggressive, tightening around the back of my neck, as if someone was trying to keep a hold of me. I was trying to scream, but no words were coming out. I was sweating and shaking, and my neck was getting worse. It started to hurt badly. I tried to scream over and over, but all that would come out were these little squeaks. It was like I was gasping for air. I remember the moment when it was like everything snapped, and I was finally able to scream for my mother and move around. I screamed at the top of my lungs. It came out crackled like a blood-curdling cry for help. She came running in, and as soon as she flung open the door and a burst of light shone in through the room, the whole thing stopped immediately. She carried me to the front room, cradling me as I sobbed hysterically. Later in life, I found out what I experienced was a form of sleep paralysis. I didn't know that at the time, though. I thought a ghost had really tried to kill me or something. From then on, I had to sleep in my mom's bed for a while, and we moved out shortly after. I'm grateful we haven't had to go back to that house since. Several decades ago, my grandfather used to have this crazy neighbor who lived on a ridge overlooking his home in central Missouri. The guy was an insane conspiracy nut who didn't allow electronics of any kind on his property and refused to recognize the local police department's authority over him. People in the neighborhood called him Tanner. I guess you could label him as what's now called a sovereign citizen. The guy had a various arsenal of weapons, killed animals for meat, brewed his own booze, and grew his own vegetables. My grandpa lost track of how many times the police drove past his house to climb the ridge and confront that man. There was once even a standoff that lasted most of the day, where the guy refused to leave his house until cops had to pull his front door off with a chain tied to a truck. He would spend brief periods of time in jail for disorderly conduct, hunting on other people's private property, and resisting arrest. He would always return home eventually, though, and the cops warned my grandfather's family that the guy was not to be approached for any reason, and if there was ever a problem, to just call them instead. They reported that Tanner set traps in his own property and had shackles and chains in his back room. My grandfather has only one distinct memory of him. One winter, he was smoking on his back porch when the crack of a rifle being fired way too close made him jump in surprise. A short-tailed hawk fell out of the sky, bouncing off the porch railing right next to him, and landed on his lawn. My grandfather looked up in shock as the hawk thrashed on the ground. From the ridgeline up above, he heard a man yell, "Don't touch that one, he's mine." My grandfather shouted back at Tanner that he would call the cops if he came down onto his property. He then went back inside and locked the door. Where the real story starts, though, is in the spring sometime in the early 80s. A rust-colored panel van broke down on my grandfather's street, and the driver pulled off to the side. He parked right on the dirt paths that led up to Tanner's place, probably not even realizing it was supposed to be a driveway. A few hours later, there was a pounding on my grandfather's door. He found 3 very large men there, asking if he was the one who broke into their van and stole all their stuff. My grandfather, not without good reason, pointed them up the hill towards Tanner's place, and the 3 made their way up the dirt path. From here, I'm going to speak about what the police eventually reported to my grandfather. The 3 men kicked in Tanner's door when they arrived. The first one through the door stepped into a bear trap that was laid out on the floor in the dark hallway. Then Tanner, who had apparently been waiting for them outside in the bushes, hit the other 2 with bear mace and forced them down the hall into his back room, where he attempted to subdue them and chain them to the wall. They escaped nearly blind, and one of them stumbled into what the police described as a barbed wire net that Tanner had set up near his back door. From down the ridge, my grandfather sat by his shed and waited to hear the commotion, but when he started hearing screams and gunshots, he called the police. When the police arrived, they found the front door wide open and several small traps set throughout the house, including an axe that was made to swing down from the ceiling. One of the men was found shackled in the back room with a knife shoved through his hand. The man in the net had been shot 4 times and was let to bleed out. Tanner was nowhere to be found. When my grandfather asked what happened to the 3rd man, the police reported there were only 2 found in the house. Both men survived and were taken to the hospital, but afterwards they were arrested for outstanding warrants. The police didn't specify, but they implied that they had been smuggling drugs or stolen goods in that van, and that's what Tanner had stolen from them. Tanner himself was never seen after that, though my grandfather did hear a report on the radio a few years later of a man matching his description that had been found dead in a ditch in Kentucky after being tortured. I always considered that one of the craziest home invasion stories I've ever heard. To this day, my family still jokes around about the missing bear trap man. Shortly after that happened to my grandfather, he moved across state to a different home. He did return once to his old house just for a look, and he could have sworn he noticed somebody looking down at him from the hill above, but maybe that was just a remnant of the past. Today, I was enjoying the nice weather at my local park. They have 2 pretty small loops, one a little more covered by trees, and one that circles around a small pond. When I got there, only a few other people were there, so I had my AirPods in one ear and was enjoying my music, singing to the open air. As I got closer to people, I would take my singing down to a lower volume, slightly louder than a whisper, to try and be considerate. While it is a public park, it's not much good to be a nuisance with other people there. People were smiling at me as I passed by, and everyone seemed to be in a really good mood. Well, I decided to go on the slightly more wooded and secluded path for my last lap before I headed home. There was an older man who passed by with his dog. We passed by each other no problem when I started to hear this weird, almost chirping sound. We were outside, so I assumed it was bugs at first, but it started getting louder and louder and less bug sounding. I briefly looked over my shoulder and realized it was an alarm or something getting closer to me. Another guy was walking behind me. He went to pass by me, and I noticed he had some weird plastic-looking rope in his hand, the kind they use around packages sometimes. It was the middle of the day, and we were in a pretty public space where I didn't feel too unsafe. I was just a little bit confused. That is, until this man, as he was passing me by, looked me dead in the eye and whispered in my ear, "If that other guy wasn't here, I would have strangled you." Not really processing what he said in the moment, I got out a confused, "Really?" Dead serious, he said yes, and twisted the rope around in his hand. He continued walking, and I got a deep chill down my spine as the reality of what he just said sunk in. I texted my partner, and he immediately called me and stayed on the phone with me until I got home. I truly believe I would have been in danger if no one else was around.